8 husbands, 8 deaths, 1 woman. In the spring of 1811, Virginia, a chilling tale spread through towns and taverns, the story of Ruth Holloway, the widow who buried every man she married. Was she cursed? Or was she a killer? Stay with me till the very end of this story to uncover the shocking truth behind America's most infamous forgotten case. And before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who loves mysterious true crime stories. Now let's step back in time and meet Ruth Holloway, the killer widow of Virginia. The year was 1811, and Virginia was a land of rolling farmlands, dusty roads, and quiet towns where everyone knew each other's name. Life moved slowly, measured by the rhythm of the seasons, planting, harvest, and church on Sundays. But beneath the calm surface, fear and superstition were never far away. People whispered about curses, hexes, and sins that brought God's wrath. And into this world stepped a woman whose life would become one of the most terrifying stories ever told, Ruth Holloway. Ruth was not born into wealth or nobility. She came from humble beginnings, a farmer's daughter raised in the countryside. But what she lacked in fortune, she made up for with charm and ambition. By her late 20s, she had already been widowed more than once. At first, neighbors pitied her. They shook their heads and muttered prayers when yet another husband of hers died. But as the years went on and the deaths began to pile up, pity slowly turned into suspicion. You see, Virginia was still a place of whispers, where gossip spread faster than wildfire. And soon those whispers all carried the same chilling question: was Ruth Holloway cursed? Or was she a murderer? Her story didn't begin with tragedy alone, it began with opportunity. Every man she married had something to offer: land, a small fortune, or social standing. And every time she buried a husband, Ruth walked away with just a little more than she had before. By the spring of 1811, she had buried 7 husbands, each one gone in mysterious ways. Some drowned, some fell ill suddenly, others met accidents that didn't quite add up. And then came husband number 8, Thomas Holloway. His death would change everything and finally bring the whispers to a boil. But before we reach that shocking moment, let's step back and understand exactly who Ruth Holloway was, and why men kept falling into her deadly web. Ruth Holloway was not the kind of woman you easily overlooked. In an age when most women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and content with their lot, Ruth stood out. She carried herself with confidence, her voice sharp yet persuasive, her smile disarming but calculated. People often said she had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Her beauty was not the soft, angelic kind praised in poetry. Instead, it was striking: dark eyes, high cheekbones, and a presence that could unsettle as much as it could attract. Men noticed her, and Ruth knew exactly how to use that attention. She was also clever. While many women of her time were limited to household duties, Ruth understood money, land, and opportunity. She listened when men spoke of business, of debts, of trade. She asked questions, carefully, curiously, and stored away every detail. Some said she had the mind of a merchant trapped inside a widow's body, and marriage for Ruth was never about love. It was about survival and gain. Each husband seemed to offer her a step up in life. A farmer with good land, a trader with coin, a preacher respected in the community. She studied them, chose them, and charmed them. To outsiders, it looked like she was simply a woman searching for security in a harsh world. But to those who would later tell her story, it looked more like the cold, deliberate work of a predator. What kept the town in confusion for so long was Ruth's performance of grief. At every funeral, she wore black, wept openly, and clutched the hands of neighbors with trembling fingers. To many, she seemed the picture of tragedy. To others, something about those tears felt rehearsed. And yet, no matter how many husbands she buried, there was always another man ready to take her hand. Perhaps they believed the past was only bad luck, or perhaps they underestimated her completely. But soon, fate, or Ruth herself, would begin to reveal a chilling pattern. At first, no one suspected Ruth of anything more than misfortune. Death came often in the early 1800s. Illness, accidents, and harsh living conditions took lives without warning. And for a time, Ruth's story looked no different. Her first husband, a farmer named John Miller, was found dead in his own bed one autumn morning. He had complained of stomach pains the night before, but by dawn, he was cold and lifeless. The neighbors shook their heads. Perhaps it was food poisoning, perhaps a sickness of the gut. Ruth wept bitterly at his funeral, her black veil dripping with tears. Months later, she married again, this time to Samuel Green, a mill worker with a small but steady income. His death was stranger. He drowned in the mill pond, though Samuel was known to be a strong swimmer. Locals said perhaps he slipped, perhaps his foot was caught. Again, Ruth appeared shattered, collapsing at the water's edge, her cries echoing through the town. People pitied her, whispering about how cursed she seemed to be. Her third husband, Joseph Carter, a trader with a wagon route, didn't last long either. He was thrown from his horse, his skull cracked on the stones of the road. Tragic, yes, but accidents with horses were not uncommon in Virginia. Still, the timing was unsettling. Each man gone within a year of marrying Ruth. The town gossiped, but excused it. Life was fragile. People died young, and Ruth, with her trembling hands and sorrowful eyes, played the part of the grieving widow so well that suspicion never lingered. But by the time her fourth husband met his end, falling suddenly ill after drinking a cup of tea Ruth had prepared, the whispers began to change. No longer was it only poor Ruth they spoke of. Now the whispers asked, why does death follow her so closely? It was the beginning of a pattern, and patterns once seen cannot easily be forgotten. By the time Ruth Holloway buried her fourth husband, the whispers in Virginia had grown louder. At first, her tragedies looked like cruel chance, but now the town began to notice the rhythm. Each man died within a year of marriage. Each death was sudden, unexpected, and often under strange circumstances. Her fifth husband, Matthew Clark, was a land surveyor, healthy, strong, and careful by nature. Yet one evening after returning from work, he complained of a bitter taste in his supper. Hours later, he was found shaking violently, foam at his lips, before finally slipping into death. A few townsfolk muttered the word arsenic, though no one dared speak it too loudly. Poison was whispered about in hushed tones, but who would accuse a grieving widow outright? Still, Ruth played her part masterfully. She dressed in black, carried her Bible, and leaned on her neighbors for comfort. At funerals, she spoke softly of God's will, her voice breaking with sorrow. To some, her grief seemed almost too perfect, too polished, as if she had rehearsed it. Her sixth husband, a small-town preacher, fell ill soon after their wedding. The congregation prayed for his recovery, but their prayers went unanswered. His death hit the community harder than the others. He was beloved, respected, a man of faith. That loss began to stir true suspicion. Some whispered that Ruth herself was cursed, a vessel of misfortune. Others quietly asked if the curse was of her own making. When her seventh husband followed the same path, healthy one day, buried the next, the town's patience wore thin. People crossed the street to avoid her. Mothers pulled their sons away when Ruth passed. Men began to whisper that to marry Ruth Holloway was to sign your own death warrant. But still, one man, Thomas Holloway, stepped forward. Whether blinded by love, wealth, or Ruth's undeniable charm, he became husband number 8, and his death would be the one that ended Ruth's deadly game. By the time Ruth Holloway married her seventh husband, the town was already uneasy. People had begun to treat her with wary eyes, as though a shadow followed wherever she walked. Men whispered that she was cursed. Women pulled their children closer when she passed, and yet somehow, another man still stepped forward to claim her hand. His name was Edward Turner, a widower himself, with a small farm and a respectable income. To Edward, Ruth seemed like a woman unfairly punished by fate, a victim of cruel misfortune. Perhaps he thought he could break the chain, prove that love could outlast the darkness that seemed to surround her. But from the very beginning, Edward's health began to falter. Neighbors remembered how he had once been strong, able to chop wood and plow fields without pause. Yet within months of marrying Ruth, he grew pale and weak, his body wasting away as if some unseen sickness had taken hold. Doctors had little explanation. They muttered about fevers, about weak lungs, but nothing ever added up. Edward died before his first anniversary with Ruth. At his funeral, the townspeople's pity was gone. This time they watched Ruth carefully, studying her tears, her trembling hands, her black veil that hid half her face. And for the first time, some swore they saw a flicker of something cold, something calculated, beneath her mourning act. The whispers hardened into quiet accusations. 8 men cannot die by chance. People began to say it openly in taverns, at church steps, and in hushed family gatherings at night. And yet no charges were brought against her. The law demanded proof, and proof was hard to find in an age before modern science. Still, Ruth was not finished. One more husband remained, a man who believed himself different, a man who thought her curse was nothing but rumor. His name was Thomas Holloway, and his death would finally tear the mask away from Ruth's carefully crafted lies. When Ruth Holloway married her 8th husband, Thomas Holloway, the town buzzed with disbelief. Thomas was no fool. He was a respected merchant, known for his sharp mind and careful dealings. He had heard the whispers, the tavern stories, the warnings spoken in hushed tones. Marry Ruth, and you'll end up in the grave. Yet Thomas brushed them aside. Some say he believed Ruth's misfortunes were nothing more than cruel fate. Others claimed he saw an opportunity. Ruth still carried wealth and land from her previous marriages, and Thomas may have thought himself clever enough to survive where others had not. Whatever the reason, he stepped boldly into her web. At first, their marriage appeared steady. Neighbors noted how Thomas seemed in good health, strong and confident as ever. For a brief moment, some even wondered if the so-called curse had finally ended. But by the spring of 1811, dark signs began to appear. On the evening of April 12th, Thomas sat at the supper table. Ruth served him stew and cider, her hands steady, her expression calm. But within an hour, Thomas clutched his stomach, gasping for breath. Witnesses later said his face twisted in agony, his body convulsing before he collapsed lifeless onto the table. His cup of cider sat before him, still half full. This time the town could not ignore what had happened. Too many husbands, too many graves, and now one more death under Ruth's roof. The whispers of poison became shouts. People demanded answers. How could so many strong, healthy men die under the care of one woman? The death of Thomas Holloway was the breaking point. The law, long hesitant, finally stepped in. For the first time, Ruth Holloway would face not just gossip and suspicion, but the full weight of an investigation. And what they uncovered inside her home would chill Virginia to its core. Thomas Holloway's sudden death was one tragedy too many. By the spring of 1811, Virginia authorities could no longer dismiss Ruth's history as bad luck. 8 men, all buried within a decade, every one of them tied to the same woman. This was no curse, they said. This was a crime. The coroner's inquest began almost immediately. Thomas's body was examined, and though medical science of the time was limited, signs of poisoning were suspected. His lips bore a faint discoloration. His stomach showed evidence of violent sickness. The cider he had been drinking was collected as evidence, and neighbors swore they had seen Ruth herself pour it. A search of the Holloway home soon followed. Inside a locked chest, hidden beneath linens, investigators discovered a disturbing collection. Small vials of powders, some white, some yellow, each unlabeled. Letters written to apothecaries asking for remedies against pests, and scraps of notes that seemed to list recipes for teas and tonics. To the untrained eye, they looked harmless, but to the coroner, they reeked of foul intent. The final blow came from the Holloway household's youngest servant, a girl of just 14. She confessed that on the night Thomas died, she had seen Ruth stirring a powder into his drink before calling him to supper. When pressed, the girl broke down in tears, insisting she was too afraid to speak before, but could no longer keep the secret. The town erupted. For years they had whispered of curses, of accidents, of strange misfortunes. Now they spoke openly. Ruth Holloway was not cursed. She was a murderer. Dragged from her home, Ruth was placed in custody. Crowds gathered outside the jail, eager for a glimpse of the woman they now called the killer widow. The stage was set for one of Virginia's most sensational trials, a trial where the truth about Ruth would finally be revealed. When Ruth Holloway was brought to Richmond for trial, the courthouse could barely contain the crowds. Farmers, merchants, widows, and even gentlemen from neighboring counties flooded the room. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the killer widow, and readers hung on every detail. Ruth entered the courtroom in a black gown, her face pale but calm. She carried herself with dignity, as though she were not the accused, but the wronged. Some swore her eyes swept over the jury like daggers, daring them to find her guilty. The prosecution laid out a chilling case. 8 husbands, 8 deaths, each man healthy before suddenly collapsing under Ruth's roof. They presented the vials found in her chest, the letters to apothecaries, and the testimony of the young servant girl who described seeing Ruth stir powder into her husband's drink. Piece by piece, the story of a black widow unfolded. The defense tried to argue misfortune. They claimed disease, accidents, and God's will had taken Ruth's husbands. Is it a crime to suffer tragedy? Her lawyer asked the jury. Ruth herself wept at the mention of curses, declaring she had only ever been a loving wife. But the crowd was not swayed. Every whisper of poison, every rumor of curses, every suspicious glance from the townsfolk weighed heavily in the room. This was more than a case, it was a reckoning. When the jury left to deliberate, silence fell over the packed courtroom. They returned in less than an hour. The foreman stood, voice steady. We find the defendant guilty of murder. A gasp rippled through the room. Ruth Holloway did not faint, did not scream. Instead, she lifted her chin, her face unreadable. The judge pronounced her sentence, death by hanging. The trial was over. But Ruth's story was far from finished. Her final act, the morning of her execution, would leave Virginia haunted for generations. The morning of June 1811 dawned heavy with clouds. In the center of Richmond, a wooden gallows had been built, and crowds pressed in from miles around to witness the fate of the woman they now called the killer widow. Ruth Holloway was led from her cell in a black gown, her hands bound, her face as calm as if she were walking to church. Witnesses later said she showed no fear, no trembling, no regret. Instead, she carried herself with the same unsettling poise she had worn in court, half sorrowful, half defiant. As she climbed the wooden steps, the murmurs of the crowd swelled. Some shouted curses, calling her a murderer, a devil in human form. Others remained eerily silent, unsettled by her composure. Even the hangman seemed nervous as he placed the rope around her neck. The sheriff asked Ruth if she had any final words. For a long moment she remained quiet, her eyes scanning the sea of faces below. Then, with a faint smile, she spoke. I only gave them what they deserved. A man's love is fleeting, but poison is forever. The crowd gasped, some in horror, some in disbelief. Before anyone could speak again, the signal was given. The trapdoor opened. Ruth Holloway dropped, her body swinging lifeless against the grey Virginia sky. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of the rope. Whatever she truly was, monster, manipulator, or victim of her own darkness, her life had come to its violent end. She was buried in an unmarked grave outside the town, denied the dignity of a headstone. Yet even in death her presence lingered. For years men swore they saw her figure in black drifting along lonely roads. Women warned their sons never to be blinded by beauty, but Ruth's story did not die with her. Instead, it became legend. Even after her execution, the story of Ruth Holloway, the killer widow, refused to fade. In taverns and churchyards, her name was whispered as a warning. Parents told their children never to trust a smile too quickly. Young men joked nervously about avoiding black widows long before the spider carried that nickname. Some believed Ruth was nothing more than a calculating murderer, a woman who saw husbands not as companions, but as stepping stones, each one leading her closer to wealth and independence. Others argued she was something darker, a soul touched by evil, a living curse upon Virginia. And a few still wondered if all those men had truly fallen by her hand, or if Ruth herself had been the victim of gossip and superstition that grew out of control. What no one could deny was the pattern. 8 husbands, 8 deaths, each one under Ruth's roof, each one too strange to ignore. Her story echoed through generations, becoming part of Virginia folklore. Even now, some claim her ghost roams the countryside, dressed in black, her face hidden beneath a veil, searching for her next unlucky groom. Whether you believe in curses, in calculated poisonings, or simply in the power of rumor. The case of Ruth Holloway reminds us of one chilling truth. Behind every smile, every charm, there may be secrets darker than we dare to imagine. And so, more than 2 centuries later, Ruth Holloway remains a shadow in American history. A woman who turned marriage into murder and love into death. If you enjoyed this dark and forgotten piece of history, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with your friends. And most importantly, stay tuned for more chilling tales from the past. Until next time, watch closely, because history always has a darker side.